basically, as I'll talk for a while, I hope I hope to plow through this so we have a few minutes just to take questions, and you can ask me about anything, and I may or may not know the answers, who knows. My name is Brant Adams. You may know my name from all the work I do with Joseph Martin as his orchestrator, and Lloyd Larson and some other folks. Joe and I met many years ago when we were doctoral students at the University of Texas, and that was many years ago, like in 1983. But my day job is, I've been the department head at Oklahoma State University for, back up 2 summers. I was department head there for 8 years, but I've been at Oklahoma State for 30 years as in music theory. Been coordinator of that area for about 20 years, and I'm happily out of administration and back to teaching, so I smile a lot more. But anyway, I thought we would talk, and I'm assuming that much of what I say will be stating the obvious, and in a session like this, I'm not even going to attempt to teach you how to write for instruments, because I don't know if that's even really what you want to do, but I'm assuming the scenario of ministers of music who are primarily maybe choral or keyboard folks who would like to, or maybe already are working with instrumental elements in your worship. The opening worship service today was a fantastic example of the potential and the kinds of things that you can do. Obviously, most of the time we all go to whatever our sources for purchasing music is, and we buy what we need and we use it, and are constantly looking for things. And there's many, many things out there that are very useful. But sometimes you just want to write it yourself, or you might consider writing it yourself. Scenarios come up, Johnny gets a won-it contest on bassoon, and his grandparents would really like for you to feature him with the choir on Sunday morning, kind of thing, and it's hard to find bassoon obligatos for choral pieces, kind of thing, right? So, what do you do? Well, okay, you try to look for some flute part and then hope you can play it 2 octaves lower or something like that. And what I'd like to try to do at the end of this is to at least allay your fears and possibly inspire you to at least try writing, albeit in a small way or maybe something big, for instruments. And so I'm mostly just going to present what you might need to know to do that. I'm not going to attempt to teach that stuff, but at least you kind of know what are the things that I kind of need to do if I'm going to be effective in writing for instruments. But my overall message, folks, is I hope to try to convince you that, you can't hurt anybody by trying. And the worst possible thing you could do would be to write something that you decided you didn't want to do. Great. So then, it's like any other skill, you would then try it again and try to do better. That's the way we all learn. So I'll talk more about that. But what are the kinds of things that you need to know when writing for instruments? These are some obvious things, but the more you can know about individual instruments, the better off you are. How many of you went to music school and took a course in orchestration? Okay. How was it? Because I took orchestration in undergrad, and it was awful. Because it was like, okay, memorize the ranges, memorize the transpositions. Here's a Bach chorale. Use common sense, put high instruments on the soprano and middle instruments on the alto and tenor, and put your bass instrument on the lower one. Copy out the parts. Okay, there it is. Kind of felt like I didn't need to pay tuition to learn how to do that. The tough thing is, and I've taught orchestration a couple of times. Oddly enough, I don't teach orchestration as part of my job. And truthfully, again, it may seem odd to some people. I don't like teaching orchestration. People shouldn't try to teach things that they sort of do instinctively, because it's very hard to break down into constituent steps that make sense to people who have no earthly idea about what you're teaching. So I like for my colleagues to teach orchestration. Anyway, I digress. But There are more things than just learning transpositions and ranges, but that's a good place to start. Now, is everybody acquainted with the notion that some instruments, when they read their part, they don't sound at the same pitch level as the piano, okay? And there's a long historical lecture in that about the evolution of different kinds of instruments, whether it's about wind instruments where initially started out much like a flutophone or a recorder where you could just do certain combinations with a few holes. And as technology developed, lots of mechanical contraptions were added so that you could do awkward finger combinations, and you could have more holes, and you end up with multiple fingerings for the same pitch. But you still have there's this historical progression of over several centuries that ended up with standard sizes of instruments that sounded the best, that were the easiest to play. The thing that I think the easiest thing to picture that is, if you all know that a bugle doesn't have any valves, right? And all you can play are the pitches of the harmonic series on one pitch level. And so you can imagine that it would be very hard to do music that changes keys or be able to play in different keys when you just have that one instrument. So you would need bugles in different sizes to play in different keys. And then eventually in the brass family, the notion of valves and putting different lengths of tubing all in the same instrument and using the valves as sort of little intersection controllers so that you can play all the chromatic pitches, and now you've got an instrument that can play chromatically. Problem is that maybe the best size of that instrument, when it reads a C, it plays a B flat. So that's the instruments that transpose. You need to get to know at least what the transpositions are for the normal instruments. A lot of you, I suspect, the instrumentalists in your church are going to be school-age kids. And then, if you're fortunate enough to have some adults who enjoy playing, then that's so much the better. But in general, if you've got a clarinetist, they probably are just going to play a B-flat clarinet. They're not going to have an A clarinet and so on, whereas a more experienced player will. The trumpet player is probably going to play a B-flat trumpet and not have a C unless they actually do some orchestral playing. And your saxophones, the E-flat and B-flat and so on. So you need to know what the transpositions are, and basic idea of transposition is that their parts are written in a key that's supposed to be easy to read, but they'll sound at different levels. So when I talk about a B-flat instrument, that means when they read a C, it sounds a B-flat, okay? If it's an E-flat alto saxophone, when it reads a C, it sounds at E-flat, a major sixth below. Or if it's a tenor saxophone, that's a B-flat instrument. If it's a baritone sax, that's an E-flat instrument, and so on. And you have to learn, if you're going to write for them, you have to make that adjustment in your part. So if I want the instruments to play in C major, I'm going to have their parts in different keys so that when they play together, it sounds like they're all playing in the same key. So let me just take that B-flat instrument, B-flat clarinet, B-flat tenor sax, B-flat trumpet. If when that instrument reads a C, it sounds a B-flat, 2 half steps down, a major second down, then I'm going to have to transpose their part up by that same distance. So while regular instruments or your pianist is reading the piece in C major, that trumpet player is going to have to be reading a part that's written in D major, a major second, okay? And it can't, if you're not used to dealing with that, it can get very confusing. But trust me, you work with it just a little bit and it just becomes automatic, all right? We use the term concert pitch a lot, which means that's the pitch of the piano. And then we talk about transposed scores, and that's where those adjustments have been made. The next thing that you have to know if you're going to write for an instrument, obviously, is its range. This is no different than writing for voices. I mean, obviously, range often varies depending upon the ability and experience of the player, as well as the instrument. Some instruments have very fixed ranges. The bottom part of the range of many instruments is absolutely fixed. Think of a violin. I mean, the open string can't sound any lower than when it's not fingered, right? And so many instruments have an absolute bottom to their range. But some instruments, like strings or like brass instruments, for example, the upper range varies depending upon how developed the player is and how strong their embouchure is and so on. But in general, you need to have an idea not only of what's the lowest note and the highest note that an instrument can play, but more importantly, if you're going to write effectively for instruments, you need to know what happens in various parts of those ranges. And if you, the way to know this really, my suggestion, and I'll have some information at the end here to be more specific, but that's the sort of thing you'll find in a textbook on orchestration. If it's a good textbook, it'll not only tell you here's the range, but it will it'll show you, you know, here it doesn't sound very good, but they can play these notes. Here it sounds warm and sonorous. Here it sounds loud and squeaky or whatever. You need that kind of experience. Now, you can read textbooks all day long, but I will say before we end today that really you want to learn this, you've got to do a lot of listening and talking to players and hearing them play so that you have the sounds in your ear, so you know when a clarinet is getting up in its upper register. And if there's any clarinet players in here, I apologize, it gets really, really annoying up there. Whereas down in their lower registers is very warm and very useful in orchestrating. So it's important to know also color changes. For example, let me just take a simple example, the flute, all right? When the flute plays around the top of the treble clef in that area, it's in its sweet spot. And if you were to hook up an oscillator, you may know what an oscillator is, you know, you play a sound in it and it graphs it. If you put a flute on an oscillator in its sweet spot, it's almost a perfect sine wave, which means it has almost no overtones present. It's just a pure tone. It more than any other instrument, it can give you that pure tone. But as it goes lower, and it's a very delicious thing in its bottom range, but it turns into a square wave because there are more harmonics and overtones present. And but the sound gets much softer when that flute gets in its lower range. As it goes above that sweet spot to the upper end of its range, up around, say, the not second, getting up to the high C, from the second ledger line up, it's shrill, and unless there are a lot of other instruments playing with it, it's not a very useful sound. If you really need pitches that high, probably it'd be good for you to switch over and use a piccolo, because then that's in the sweet spot for the piccolo. So that's just one example, getting to know, and if you're working with younger or less experienced players, you want to make sure that you're writing to that sweet spot, just like you would write vocal arrangements for, say, the cambiata singer, the young boys who are going through the change, or for kids of whatever age. You have to be aware of that, because all instruments have limitations, and obviously the younger the player, the less experienced, the more you need to address and limit yourself within the constraints of those limitations. Some instruments, facility, I'm not talking so much about expertise of player, as I'm talking about that some instruments are just more facile than others. They play fast notes easier. There's a big difference between what you can write for a violin and what you can write for a tuba. As you might imagine, a tuba, just by virtue of its size, by virtue of the more difficult, the level of difficulty it is to find notes in the partials on that big mouthpiece, you have to be careful not to write something that's too technical, too many notes happening too fast. Now, everybody knows a tubist who very proudly performs the Flight of the Bumblebee at the community concert. Okay, I mean, it happens. Certainly there are great tubists that play a lot of fast notes, but I don't know, trombone. Do you do a lot of Flight of the Bumblebee on the trombone?
Some do.
Some do?
Some do.
You got to really, it's especially when you're going from 7th position to 1st position in a 30-second note. That really moves around. Endurance. For string players, endurance is really not an issue, right? They don't have to breathe. They can breathe whenever they want to. It's all here. Brass players, especially if they're younger players, this is going to wear out really quickly. unless you've got more experienced players. So you have to be aware of endurance. One of the things that I find in my students' writing is that they get the instruments going, especially winds, and goes 35 or 40 bars without a rest. And a lot of times I will work with, you can get the same effect and put an eighth rest in here and there to allow them to breathe. And they're like, well, they'll know where to breathe, won't they? Depends on what you're writing. But you do have to watch out for all of those practical considerations. Tuning tendencies, this is getting into kind of really technical stuff. Not that you really need to be an expert on that to try some writing, but it is good to know. For example, string players like to play in sharp keys. Now there's a very practical reason for that. If you take a violin, the open strings are a G, then up a fifth to D, then to A, and to E. If you think of how those notes work into your favorite keys, then you get an idea of why something in D flat major doesn't really please them a lot. Now, again, good, experienced, professional level players should be able to function just fine in 6 flats. But if they have a lot of music, they'll grumble about it. I hear it at my recording sessions, working with professionals. There's always snide remarks made about those pianist composers who think, that D flat would be a great key to have the piece in. Why not D, where so many other options are available to them? Brass players tend to like to play in flats. Part of that is because of their interval of transposition. Saxophones too. So if you're an E flat instrument or a horn in F, but especially the E flat where you're transposing parts up a major sixth, if you get into very many sharps, you actually have to wrap around and write that part in flats. You have to write it up a diminished seventh instead of a major sixth, because you get into double sharps and double flats in the key signature, or double sharps in the key signature. Something else that comes with experience, that if you're going to want to write for certain instruments, I'll take an extreme example. If you're going to write for harp. Writing for harp terrifies me. I write a lot for harp in orchestrations, but I only know how to do a few things. And I'm constantly calling harpists to ask them, because you have to learn things like their pedal ground. You have to learn how they adjust pedals. You have to learn that there are certain limitations to how chromatically they can play. String instruments do so many special effects with bowings, with harmonics, with bow techniques, that if you're going to write for them, even fairly simple stuff, it's a good idea to spend some time getting to know how their notation works. One of the first things I do when I teach orchestration, it seems like all orchestration books start with the strings. That's because even bad voice leading sounds great in strings. And strings don't have to breathe, so you don't have to be watching so many things. But slurs for string parts mean something very different from wind players, or from the way you use them as singers, or even the way you see them in piano music. Most other instrumental families use slurs as a way of connecting notes. Wind players see that at the end of a slur is a good place maybe to breathe. Same way with singers. With singers, we tend to use slurs mostly when there are more than one note over a single syllable. But with strings, it's bowing. And it's kind of an odd thing, because no matter how carefully you try to go through and bow a passage, when you hand it to the player, they're probably going to change it. But what I've found is I even see scores that are sent to me to record from other arrangers whose names you would recognize, who just abdicate the whole bowing thing in their string parts and don't put anything, which technically would indicate separate bows on every note. Well, that would make them sound like a middle school beginning orchestra, and they know better than that. So it takes a lot of time, because a string section is going to want to bow pretty much the same way. So it's better, and I would give this to you as advice if you're going to write for string players. If you think about it, you can at least put in your best guess about bowings, And they will respect your writing so much more. If you've got something in there, they'll feel free to change it. And they will change it, because most of us, unless you're a string player, you probably don't come to the task with perfect instincts on bowing. But I find that players would much prefer to change something that's there rather than see that, oh, well, there's no bowing to it. What am I supposed to do? So it's kind of a little respect thing. So those are examples of notations and editings that you kind of need to be able to do. By the way, stop me if you have a question, otherwise I'm going to barrel through because I've probably got too much here. Another thing that eventually, if you want to write for instruments, you have to learn kind of what's idiomatic. In other words, what are they used to, what do they do best? That comes back to that whole, for example, the writing for tubas versus violinists, how many notes. What do they do best? Are some better for melody, or do some have the ability of being good for what I call harmonic or rhythmic harmony? Doing the pa-pa of pa-pa, which instruments would do that? Which instruments would do the which would do the pa-pa? What are they accustomed to seeing in the parts? How much information? Just as an aside, I would say you really can't give them too much information. The more information you have, like articulations and slurs and things like that, the better. Yeah.
Where are some resources that we can go to find this information out?
I'm going to list 3 orchestration books here in a few minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and answer your question, even though it'll come up again. Where I have learned what I know mostly is from writing stuff, handing it to a player, and having them react to it, and or hearing it played and go, you can see where they stress out. I'll give you a real quick example. I taught orchestration this spring. All spring long I said, I'm putting red marks on stuff that they're turning in, going, you gotta put in articulations, you gotta put in slurs, you gotta put in dynamics. Some kids just don't think that's important, they just want to write the notes. So then the very last day of class, I was able to have the university orchestra, because their concert was over, and we brought in our full orchestra final projects and had the kids conduct their own projects. And I sat there and I just had this sarcastic grin most of the time, because so many times they got up on the podium and here comes 16 hands out of the orchestra going, how do you want us to play this? Well, there wasn't any information there, So if you're going to write for your folks, even though you go, this is just for church and it's not that big a deal, I would encourage you not to have that attitude. I would encourage you to say, it's not that hard to start learning. You may not know everything, but you do it by trying and talking to folks. How would you like to see this noted? I get on the phone sometimes. I'll get an email from somebody who doesn't like something that I've done in an orchestration. Doesn't like the way I wrote it, So I'll call someone I trust and say, okay, I've just gotten this message. Do you validate this? Is this true? So it's that's where you get much better information than just some textbook. But it all can be helpful. So it's good to know what they're accustomed to seeing in their parts, because obviously, if you try to speak their language, even if you just learn that much of their language, again, they will be in the mood to really help you learn more, as opposed to acting like you don't know that they even have, that there are certain idiomatic things that go into their parts, and just having that conversation. So what's easy for a given instrument, what's difficult, not only difficult parts of their ranges, but for wind instruments, tonguing is an issue, for example, that you need to know about. Is there a better way to notate, for example, a slur going to a staccato note? Did you really want tia-ta, or did you want tia-a? That's where you can that's getting really picky, but I deal with that all the time, because I know that if I get it right on paper, it won't take time. If your job is like mine, where you got you've got money going out the window every minute that goes by, and you've got all these players, and you've got to get through all of this music, because there is no tomorrow. If you don't get it done, it's not going to get done, and then the publishers won't have their stuff, and then you lose your job. I just know that the more that I do on paper and show on paper, the better that first reading is going to be. And I think that's your caveat. Your caveat in notating for instruments or choirs or anything is you want to put enough information on that page to do everything you can to guarantee that the first time they read that part, they'll get it right. That it will be as close as what you imagined as possible. That won't happen on your first attempt, folks. It might not happen on your first 50 attempts, but you'll get better at it if you just attend to that level of detail. And I think, as we're all trying to do our best, we're in the Lord's service. We ought to try to do the best. Doesn't matter how quote unquote professional or local your work is. It's part of being okay, thank you. It's part of doing our best. So knowing what's hard for the instruments, what's easy, that's important. This comes a little bit. This is a modification of something I talk about. No, that's the next slide. Okay, your purpose of your arrangement. When I talked to Randall a little bit about this, and I also talked to Joe just to get some ideas of what we should talk about. Just looking at the scenarios, and I'm going to fly through this. You might start with just writing a single instrument obligato, either for to be done with congregation like we heard today, or you may be wanting to add instruments to a choir number or something to go along with the soloist. Or you may be wanting to write some pieces for a standalone ensemble. Maybe you just have an odd combination of instruments available to you among your volunteers. You can't find instrument arrangements commercially that sound good, so now you're going to put together this sort of polyglot of instruments. So that might, that obviously you have to do different things depending upon which scenario you're working on. And so I thought if we take an example, because I imagine you're getting tired of hearing me talk, I want to give you kind of an example of what I'm talking about. To do that, I have to escape good old PowerPoint here, so you're going to see all kinds of funky stuff on the screen here for a minute. You have in your packet there, you have a little trumpet obligato it's intended to go along with congregational singing for, say, the final verse of Holy, Holy, Holy. Now, when you look at that, you can sort of see the kinds of rhythmic ideas that are there. Let me play an example of this, and I apologize. This is going to be a kind of a finale playback on this. It sounds great if it goes through like a synthesizer or something. As you know, it sounds kind of odd on a computer, but rather than me just playing it on the piano, and I don't have a recording of a real trumpet player playing it. But okay, so hopefully this will work. Sure, I'm through that. I know.
Gosh,
I'll tell you what, I've used Finale forever. I've not really done much with Sibelius.
Hey, it doesn't do that in Sibelius.
But, what was that?
They're used Sibelius, yeah.
That meant it was
So, we tend to think of brass instruments. There's certain rhythmic figures and gestures that are pretty typical, and there's nothing innovative about this at all. It's just what you might do. There's a lot of arpeggiation of harmonies and connecting chord tones through little short, stepwise scale things. I would point out to you, notice what I'm talking about, articulations and slurs, because without them it doesn't sound as idiomatic. And that's not asking the trumpet player to all of a sudden play two notes at once. It's sort of an ossia situation. If you don't have high A's in your, then you can play the lower notes. Now that's very different kinds of stuff from, if you'll look at the one of Joe's pieces, the Epitaph. And I'm going to play. I have a much better recording of that. This is for violin, and I think you'll see that just the rhythmic ideas. Because I have a whole arrangement, I didn't want to cut down the trees to print the whole thing. Let me see if I can. Oh, I know. This one I have to go out on the web. This is a real recording. Now, obviously, it's a different mood from Holy, Holy, Holy. This is a sadder song. So when you're writing obligato, this is for obligato with choir, and one of the things that you need to think about is how do I want to use these instruments? For example, I would hope that it would be against your common sense to say, I'm going to write this instrument just playing all the time along with the whole piece. Now I did that with Holy, 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 but again, remember the scenario there was probably making something special out of a final verse or something. And if you think about what happened at the worship service earlier today, again, wonderful examples of what I'm talking about. This is a completely different situation. I've got a choir. I don't want the violin to compete for attention. So, for example, a lot of things are going to happen in between phrases, right? Like very brief, momentary interludes, little musical melodic commentaries on the end of a phrase or so on. And then we have this moment right here where it does play along with the choir, but I'm very careful to get it up in a high register so it's, again, not competing with the register of where the choir is singing. That's just an example of the kinds of things you want to think about if you're going to start adding instruments, because you don't want to add instruments and cause them just to be a distraction, or, you know, and believe me, I'm speaking from experience. You spend that big chunk of your budget to hire an orchestra with your choir, and then you spend the entire time begging your singers to sing louder and begging the orchestra to play quiet, more quietly. The way to handle that, if you're writing something, is write it so that you're not setting them up to compete. Now, if you've got 60, 70 voices in your choir, it's not a problem. If you've got 15, then it's an issue. And so you have to be judicious about that. But you can construct your obligato or your accompaniment so that you can avoid confrontation between them. And then pick a moment or two that maybe is a high point where, you know, if the choir is repeatedly singing glory to God, glory to God, glory to God, okay, the congregation's gotten that. So then if you kind of blow out the choir for one of those glory to Gods, it's not a problem. You know, it just heightens the emotion, right? But you want to make sure that you don't work at cross purposes with yourself, especially, those of us who are in ministry understand that we're not presenting a concert on Sunday morning. We are actually trying to communicate messages to our congregations, and so we're trying to do things that help intensify the message that we're trying to portray. Okay, any questions, comments on that? Common sense, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty much common sense. All right, so I'm going to go back to Mr. PowerPoint here. So I'm about to run out of time here. I want to talk a little bit about orchestration. I don't know if this is something that you have any desire to get into. It seems, well, I just wanted to talk about it since that's kind of what I do. And you can miniaturize this to the sort of things that you do. Really, orchestration serves a variety of purposes, and the type of orchestrating, the kind of orchestrating that you tend to do in an orchestration class is really not so much orchestrating as it is transcribing. And I make that distinction, meaning that transcription is where you take something that's pre-written and you just basically assign instruments, break it up into parts, and decide, you assign colors and instruments, and what's there is really just an instrumental rendering of probably some kind of like a Bach chorale or a piano piece. And it's a great pedagogical technique, and it's also a great way to expose people to literature that is not maybe indigenous to their instrument. Orchestrated accompaniments, that's obviously the meat and potatoes of what we do with our cantatas and so on and so forth. But my process is a combination. When I'm working with Joe or any composer, it's a combination of transcription and accompaniment, and that's just my technique. Not everybody goes with that. For example, like the things that you hear with Word, or some of the more contemporary Christian publishers, their orchestrations bear very little resemblance to the accompaniment in their octavos, because the accompaniment in their octavos are mostly harmonic arpeggiations, and that's about it, or rhythmic kinds of things. So those orchestrators tend to add a lot more new material. In my relationship with Joseph Martin, Joe, I always say he kind of knows how to write for orchestrators, and there are some other composers that do that too. Lloyd Larson, Pepper Choplin. They give you hints so you can take what they write and then vary it, modify it, and create some dimension and some background and things with it. So it's a combination of transcription, trying to provide an accompaniment, and doing some arranging along the way. I listed arranging and composition separately because they are two different things. Composition, I'm really saying, would be something that you would simply create entirely. You would come up with your melody, your progression, or your gestures, and then you would write it for orchestration. Arranging, of course, is taking, again, some pre-existing material. Yes?
So when you work with Joe, are you using the keyboard accompaniment that he
What they
has
send me,
already written?
our process literally is Joe writes his stuff in Finale. He sends it to Lee Dingler, and Lee Dingler does what is very close to the final engraving, the page that you see in the publication, and then that is sent to me.
Okay. So you're not working just with the melody. You're working with the whole accompaniment already.
And I take, again, because he knows how to write.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you just play the notes he has in his accompaniment, you'll see half note chords in a slow piece. I mean, on a piano, that's going to decay. There's nothing happening there. But it's because he's hearing that as probably a string section.
Mm-hmm.
And then because I've known him since before he was Joseph Martin, back when he was Joe, I don't hesitate to play around with his stuff a little bit. And but different orchestrators do it different ways. And my process is very different from someone who's writing an orchestration for a rhythm section piece. Because if you have a rhythm section, guitar, bass, drums, that kind of thing, where the harmonic element is taken care of by the rhythm section, you have a lot more freedom than when you're just writing for, our stuff tends to sound a little more symphonic, because I don't use, unless it's something where we're using piano, or where the new piece that we're working on now for next Easter is a sort of a folk sounding version of hymn tunes, and so I've got guitar and banjo and stuff like that in there. But in general, it's just the nature of what he and I work together on. That's not what we're able to do. It's very different, like I said, for the guys that are working with rhythm sections, that like a David Clydesdale, where you've got the rhythm section as the core. Now you're free to write cello lines all by themselves and stuff, which doesn't fill in the harmony if you don't have rhythm section. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And I'll just throw in this other little dig. I certainly believe that arrangement is composition. If you're really writing an arrangement, you're really contributing new material to the product. It is composing. It's just not the same thing as starting from nothing. What can effective orchestrating accomplish? Just some ideas here. I'm going to zip through this. I know you can read. I hate people that just read their PowerPoint, but that's what I'm going to do now. Enhance emotional experience. You're able to add tension and release because there are orchestral devices that can create that. Part of that is, folks, is that we live in a music-saturated environment, right? Especially television and movies and advertising. And so if you've grown up in this culture, you have learned subconsciously. If I play this is a silly example, but if I play this, you know exactly what to picture, don't you? Right? Back in the old days when silent movies, there are big volumes of piano music that are just simply, it's stuff to play, but they're titled by emotion, jealousy, fear, love, whatever, and so we know all, you can get into all of that emotional thing, but we're really trying to heighten the emotion, add interest through instrumental color, and sort of related to this, when I first started working with Shawnee Press, back in the days when Lou Kirby was still with us, their common practice was to start out by recording a piano track, and then you went in the studio and you played the orchestration against that, and it all ended up in the mix. Now, I personally detest that, because having the piano double everything that's going on in the orchestration is not a sound that I enjoy. Part of it is because the piano is an equal tempered instrument, and you lose what you can achieve with instruments that aren't tied to that kind of tuning. But to me, adding the instruments creates a color palette that far expands what you can get, which is the keyboard. Now, I'm a pianist, that's my instrument, and I spent the first 20 years of my life practicing. Now I play like a duck with mittens, but when I got into orchestrating, I was just like, forget the piano, man. This is, I'm sure organists feel that way, I have all of this under my fingers. Pianist, you just play the one little thing, right? Don't tell Joe I said that, okay? Intensify the effect of compositional events, and I would expand that to say you can intensify the effect of the moments in the music that will drive that text and message home. I truly believe that. When you're orchestrating a piece about the crucifixion, that is really an issue to think about. Okay, when Joe is, or whatever composer is zeroing in on the crux of the message, what kind of a sound environment am I going to create? Can I create so that message can be received as efficiently and as poignantly as possible? Delineate form through texture changes. One of the things that you can do is, of course, you change the different groupings during the course of an orchestration, and sometimes you do that at structural points, so that so that you can help the listener move from, okay, we finished this idea, now we're going on to something new. Even if it's just like going from one verse to another verse, sometimes you can create, you can help the listener hear relationships that are not there just by listening to one color all the way through. And you can create dimension. And dimension is a term that I use a lot in my orchestration class. Foreground and background. That sounds like a very simple concept, and it is. If you've ever seen documentaries about, say, Disney animation, in the early days, back with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the creation of the glass box with all the different panes, and the notion of moving through that forest and things passing and getting blurred and out. It's the same kind of thing with orchestrating, that you're thinking about the background, in synthesizer terminology, the pad, and then what's going to be out front, and maybe there's counter melodies, or there's something else that you can add, and then you can overlay harp at important junctures. You can overlay percussion to sort of put the shimmer, or in painting, I think of using white on those rose petals just to give it a little bit of a glisten, something like that. Those are all things that I think about when I'm orchestrating. To be an effective instrumental arranger, you need to know everything we talked about, but not all at once. And you don't need to know it all before you try to do it, okay? I say that with all the fervor in my heart. But eventually that would be your goal, was to know about a lot of these things we talked about. It is, if you're really going to do this a lot, but even if you're not, be sensitive when you listen, so that you begin to hear what are some instrumental combinations that work well. There is a lexicon, I don't mean there's a physical book, but there are instrumental combinations that are kind of stock combinations that always work. Simple example, trills and the flutes and picks, triangle along with it. It just makes it work. It just makes it work. You just kind of learn, eventually you'll learn to know things like that. You have to learn the correct formatting to set up your score and parts, and extracting parts. It's time consuming, but if the players are going to play, they got to have a part. And the parts have to be, those are things that you have to learn. And again, orchestration textbooks can help you with that. I just tried to anticipate some reactions to all of this. Where do I learn all this? Somebody's asked that. I'm going to give you an answer to that in just a moment. Maybe I just shouldn't try. Oh, please try. What's the worst that can happen? You're not going to lose your job because, the clarinet obligato was really too high. I mean, you might get somebody going, I really wish you wouldn't do that again. But, okay, we'll take it down an octave next time. What happens if I try and it sounds terrible? You try again, right? Is it worth all the time it'll take? You have to be the judge of that. I'd like to sell you on the notion that, yeah, it's worth it. I tell you what, there's few things in life that are more exhilarating than spending a lot of hours writing something, and then you hear it played, and you go, man, that wasn't half bad, man. It is. I watch this in students all the time. Students who don't think they can do this, and then they walk in, and yes, it's not really great, but in their ears you can tell it just sounds wonderful. And so, experience that. Experience that. Okay, so if you decide you're going to do it, where do you start? We're coming to the end here. Listen, 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 listen. Be in sponge mode. I mean, a lot of what I've learned about orchestration is sitting, of course I work in a university, so I have plenty of concerts to go to all the time. But I'm there, I'm watching the string player's bow. I'm trying to pay attention to what they're doing. I'm watching the conductor. I'm listening to what special effects are going on. I'm going to the percussion teacher going, how did you do that? What do you mean wind machine? Get a reliable orchestration textbook. I've listed 3 here, and I would just say Google them. I don't remember the publishers for all of these. The most comprehensive one is the first one, the Samuel Adler. Adler taught at Eastman for many, many, many years. He's a well-known composer. The problem with that is actually that it's encyclopedic, but it has a great appendix with the ranges and so on, and you can look up the individual instrument, and he does have the description of the various parts of the ranges and so on. So it's It's a little classical oriented. It has some missing stuff, even in it's getting ready to come out in its 4th edition, and it's still it's a little artsy maybe for having all the information that you want. Technique of Orchestration. This is a book that has been used for generations in colleges by Kent Kennan and my composition teacher, Donald Grantham, both of them at University of Texas. It's a lot smaller than the Adler, more compact, and it's reliable. It just doesn't have a great level of detail. Also, another book that I really like and I use for certain things, Instrumentation and Orchestration by Alfred Blatter. It's not a real popular orchestration book, although it's still in publication. But if you want, like for example, if I need to find out about recorders or I need to find out about a banjo, it has a lot more information. It has a great table of trombone positions, all the different trombone, depending on which attachments you have, so that you can make sure you're not writing something that's just not playable. So those are 3 books I would recommend that you look at, and if you want to, and they're probably in the order of expensiveness. Now, probably the Kennan is the least expensive, would be my guess. But talk to players, get their advice. That's just an absolute required resource. And then to do this by hand, and I'm old enough to remember when we did this by hand, and we couldn't churn out the music we churn out now if we were having to do it by hand. We'd have to have a lot more people doing it. If you think you're going to do this very much at all, any writing, even if it's just choral arranging, and finale or Sibelius, that's like Republican and Democrat. I mean, it's we get into heated discussions. Truthfully, they're both wonderful. Sibelius has perhaps not quite as steep a learning curve when you're starting out. Why do I use finale? I use finale because I started on finale before there was a Sibelius, and I'm too old and stubborn to try to learn something new. But they're neither one perfect, but especially if you're going to do something where you have to extract parts, it's the only way to go. And the first purchase is very expensive, and they do get you into a cycle of having to buy updates every so often.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to do it, it's well worth it. And you can go in and use it briefly online for free to try your hand at it if you want to. So my ultimate advice to you is to just start and see what happens. I was going to play some orchestrations and talk about that, but we're pretty much out of time, and some of you got that I want to float look in your eye. Does anybody have any questions or anything that
I'm just curious why you included these other examples.
because I was going to use it, I was going to show you some orchestrations of those. But I tell you what, if you'll come, the next breakout sessions, those are both from Journey to Hope, and Joe Martin is presenting a reading session on that cantata, so you can bring those along. And it really answers your question. What you have there is what I work from. Okay? And in fact, Joe and I are meeting while I'm here to go through the Easter cantata for next year, to check tempos. I want to show him the error of his ways.
Is there something that you need to know in particular if you're wanting to write a little something to go with a praise bandy type thing? It's like a...
I think it's pretty much the same thing. The advantage to a praise band, I mean, if you've got guitars, you have like guitar and...
We're working on these things.
Okay, I mean, it's kind of part of that discussion about whether you have a rhythm section or not. If the rhythm section is there and is taking, or just if you've got a pianist, I'm sure, or some kind of a keyboardist, they're taking care of all the harmonic stuff. So what you can write can be obligato to that, like in the worship services today, especially the use of the violin and cello. I mean, it's just, you're writing a counter melody there. The nice thing about strings, of course, is that they don't tend to compete with voices because they're not loud. But if you're writing for saxophone or a Chicago kind of, trumpet and sax kind of thing, it depends on how sort of jubilant you want to be with it. But I still think if you just use common sense and remember that what you really want to come out of that is the message in the text. Even if it's just 65 repetitions of God is good, whatever it is. But maybe then at that point, if it's something that that it's not texty and it's not message rich, maybe it's just a celebration kind of a thing, then you might think about working toward a climax. You know, how can I be adding instruments, getting them more and more so that you're working your worshipers, helping to intensify their emotion. That's a really vague answer, because without having a specific thing, I don't know that.
There is a breakout about using instruments with the praise band.
Yes, and also
Sometimes.
I see Stephen Hyde is doing a thing about instrument speak,
Yeah.
how to talk to instrumentalists. If you're really interested in this, you've got to go to that session too, because he'll do a great job with that. I thought there was one.
Yeah, I was just curious, how often do you hit a roadblock where you have this wonderful composition in your mind and you start writing the one part for one instrument and realize there's a mechanical problem with the instrument in that range, therefore you have to shift it and you break something else in the process in another part, and how much give and take is there between parts? Is
Well,
that a common problem?
And it is a discipline thing, but you have to learn to allow yourself to go back, and if you have a better idea or something, you go, that's. And I now have the advantage that where I'm the ones in the studio, I know I'm going to be conducting this. It used to scare me to death to have to put the parts in the score into an envelope and just mail it to Delaware Watergap and hope, gee, I hope the sessions went well, you know, because and I mean those guys were smart enough that if there were problems, they knew how to fix it. But I'm constantly trying to learn from what snagged us the last time, and asking the question, as wonderful as this idea is it worth it? Is it really going to make a difference? Sometimes even whether or not that instrument is there. If there's only 2 measures out of 120 that you're using the piccolo, do you really want to require that? Especially if it's a standalone piece. If it's a cantata, I don't worry about that because I got to have the appropriate pieces. But practical things like that, I think you have to use as much common sense and pragmatic thinking as you possibly can. And all of this stuff is just, my intention is for you to understand that these are the kinds of things you ought to be paying attention to if you want to do this sort of thing. Okay, you're not going to exit that door now knowing how to write great illustrations or anything. But I want to tell you that you can't hurt anybody. The worst thing that can happen is that you do better the next time. And you'll never do it if you don't try it. And then make nice with your players, because they can be a tremendous resource. Okay? All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
I appreciate your attention.